Hello everyone and welcome to All Your Basics. This is the pilot episode of what I hope is going to be a series focused on helping new players get the hang of building decks in Duelyst and playing them. So it is going to be new player focused, but hopefully anyone can learn something from it. What I'm going to do is, in each episode, I'm going to build a deck right in front of your very eyes, like magic, and I'm going to explain exactly why I'm putting in the cards that I'm putting in. And what the thought process behind the deck overall is, and kind of hopefully convey some lessons that you can use yourself. And then obviously we're going to jump on the ladder and have a bash and see if it works. The deck I have for you tonight is pretty fun. It's a Vanar deck. I have pre-built it. I've got it planned. In fact, on the second monitor that is currently invisible to you, I have the list. But it's not in my collection. Instead of walking you through the list as exists, I'm going to build it from scratch in front of you, and we can assemble it as we go. You come with me on this journey. Let's do this. So, whenever you build a deck, you need a plan. You need a reason for your deck to exist. It could just be, I want to learn how to play Duelyst, but we have the starter decks for that. Once we've branched out beyond just playing the starter decks, we want our decks to know exactly what they need to accomplish and how. Those are the two questions. What are we going to do and how? Generally the what is just attacking your opponent to death, and there are lots of different ways to do that, to deal those 25 plus a little bit of life gain points of damage. So we're going to build a Kara Winterblade deck. Cara is great for any sort of budget deck building, which I'm largely going to be focusing on in this series. She is excellent at turning whatever random basics, commons, anything you give her, and turning them into giant monsters by way of her awesome Bloodborne spell. So let's take a moment to talk about this Bloodborne spell. So obviously all of the generals have Bloodborne spells which give them a certain ability and a certain theme. And some of them are more generic than others. For instance, Argian's, well, he likes to have minions that you can make bigger. That's generally, that's generally a good thing to be doing in Duelyst. Whereas if you look at something like Lilith, who makes multiple Wraithlings, which you can then synergize with the Abyssian Deathwatch cards, or Xerix, who makes Dervishes, which synergize with the Dervish tribal, this kind of got a bit more of a deck building slant and encouragement. If you compare the two Vanar generals, Faye's hero power has no real explicit synergy, but is quite good at sort of pushing damage to their face later on, so it's fairly good in aggressive decks. Kara's, though, although there aren't really creatures which directly synergize with being pumped, apart from a few notable exceptions, which we'll get to, Kara loves to have a handful of random creatures and make them very big. And that kind of leads us to a strategy that is normally called midrange. So, in card games, there is kind of a spectrum of the speed of your deck. We go from aggressive decks, otherwise known as aggro, which like to push damage to the opponent's face, usually sort of ignore what they're doing, and kill them before they get off the ground. So ideally your opponent's plan doesn't matter, because you're so fast that you can just deal them 25 damage first. Or you deal them a bunch of damage, but not quite lethal, and then while your opponent's sitting there trying to kill you, while on something like 5 life, you're drawing cards to look for a Phoenix Fire, or using, say, Faye's Bloodborne spell to deal the final points. On the other end of the spectrum is control. Control decks don't really want to attack the opponent until they have to. They want to commit all of their resources to trading with the opponent's resources. So the concept of trading is, if I spend a card to do something, and you spend a card to nullify that thing, we've both spent a card on the exchange, and they've traded. So if I play a minion, and you crash your minion into it, and they both die, we've traded a minion. I've spent a card, and you've spent a card. And that's trading. It's what we call a 1-for-1. Control decks like to have cards which trade with more than one of the opponent's cards, such as Shadow Nova or Mercantor Warbeast, these cards that can deal damage in an area, or a large minion that removes another minion and then can trade with something else, such as the Dancing Blades. And this allows them to have this overwhelming late game where all they have to do is kill your stuff and wait, and then at some point you'll have no stuff and they'll have lots of stuff and they can kill you with whatever they've got in hand. Mid-range decks are in the middle of those two things, as you kind of maybe guess from the name. So a mid-range deck plays a slower game against aggressive decks by playing lots of big minions to the board and beating the smaller minions that the aggro deck plays. Against a control deck, you beat them by playing lots of big minions to the board and overwhelming your opponent's ability to remove them. Cara is really good at this because it doesn't matter what minions you put in your deck, they don't have to be particularly big, they can be small and have useful abilities. She can make them big. And even better, if you put in small minions that are designed to be kind of small and crappy, but that have really good, say, opening gambit abilities, and then you apply Kara's Bloodborne spell to them, we just get loads of value. We get advantage all up in the shop. And what I mean by value is our minion does a thing. You know, say it's an ephemeral shroud, it dispels an opponent's minion, makes it from a strong minion into a rubbish one, and then normally your 2/2 ephemeral shroud just dies, right? The general attacks it, so you've spent a card dispelling their minion and dealing 2 damage to their general, essentially, because their general has removed it. So when the general remove things, that's normally bad for you, because other than the cost of their life total, that's essentially free in terms of cards. So normally a mid-range deck or a control deck isn't too keen on having its cards removed by the opponent's general. Cara can make that ephemeral shroud into a 3/3 or a 4/4, which no longer dies to the opponent's general. Which means that we can play all these little utility creatures, or things like Healing Mystic, which just, you know, it's a generic OK on curve body. It's a 2/3 for 2 that's sort of baseline, and it has a little bit of a bonus on it. And then we turn that into a 7/8 with a little bit of bonus on it for 2 mana, and your opponent's just there like, what is this? And so what Cara wants to do is keep up on the board early on by playing sort of ordinary minions and minions with useful abilities, so that you can fight against aggro and get a little bit of a foothold against control. And then once we've got a couple of Bloodborne spell activations off, just snowball onto the board with all these huge minions and massively overwhelm the opponent. And it's really fun. And it's very cheap. All you need is good neutrals, good commons, which this game is beautifully full of. There's loads of very solid cards in Duelyst that you can get at low rarities. And so I really wanted to do Cara for this first episode because she is wonderfully budget friendly. So if you've been playing for a few days, you should be able to build this deck. Or a deck like it. So just to recap, we're going to play a mid-range deck. We're going to try and play lots of big minions to the board and get lots of value off of their abilities plus their now large bodies. We're going to overwhelm the opponent sort of in the you know, around turns 4, 5, 6 in the mid game, and crush them with our excessively oversized ephemeral shrouds until they beg for mercy, and it's going to be great. Let's get Cara in there. So Cara likes to have minions, as you might expect. Her Bloodborne spell synergizes exclusively with minions, but you can't really get by without some number of removal spells. We need to be able to mitigate certain things that you just can't mitigate with creatures. If there were minions that could do the same things removal spells could do, no one would ever play them, right? And what removal spells give us is the ability to affect something very cheaply from a distance. Or bring down something gigantic that we just can't deal with random bodies. So the first such card, we're going to put in 2 copies of this, Aspect of the Fox. This card is wonderful for dealing with horrible big things that you just can't really fight fairly. Things like Vorpal Reavers, which is a Vorpal Reavers is 6/6 for 6 with celerity that when it dies splits into a load of little 1/1s. It's just insane amounts of advantage. It can deal huge amounts of damage because it can activate twice. Yuck. No thank you. Let's turn that into a 3/3. This card is not great to play early because spending an entire card just to turn their like 3/6 into a 3/3 is not normally worth it. A 3/3 is slightly too big to just die to Cara for free, so we can't just ignore the creature that comes out of it. But it's really good at nerfing something that costs 6 or 7 or 8 mana. Like maybe your opponent plays a Dragon Ball Golem. It's a 10/10. We don't want to have to deal with that. Now it's tiny. The second removal spell we're going to add is Chromatic Cold. This is another staple. Both of these cards see a lot of play. Chromatic Cold is great because it's a dispel. Dispel is really useful for obviously removing abilities from creatures, but that doesn't sound great. But there are a lot of ways to make a creature larger in Duelyst, and lots of abilities that are relevant from a distance, and Chromatic Cold deals with all of that. It also removes Death Wishes, such as cards like Duelyst, which is a 5/3 that when it dies spawns a 0/10 with Provoke near the general, if you haven't seen that before. Duelyst is played quite a lot, and being able to dispel that guy removes having to grind through this 0/10. So this card also insta-kills things like Jaxi, Chakri Avatar, all these like annoying cheap minions that can be huge threats over the course of the game if the game goes a certain way, and it just poof, gone. It's also really funny against these Fenrir War Masters because it's toughness 2 and has a Dying Wish, and it removes the Dying Wish and then removes the toughness. Job done. And the third and final removal spell we're going to put in is sort of cheating. This card is perfect for Cara. It's called Cryogenesis. This card is great. You know, I was talking about 1-for-1s earlier where you trade your card with their card. This card is a 2-for-1, just straight up easy 2-for-1. You remove an enemy minion and you draw a card. You draw a Vesper minion from your deck. Obviously that's quite a limited set of minions, but we can just replace it and get a different one. So as long as we make sure that there's at least one Vesper in our deck at all times, as much as we can, then Cryogenesis is just deal 4, draw a card. For only 3 mana, that's ridiculous. And it's also really good for pegging, you know, 4/4s with when you cast a spell, deal 1 damage, or when a creature dies, deal 1 damage from across the board. These cards are very difficult to remove with just minions because they'll often be hiding off in the back. So Cryogenesis is like, boom, normal ranged minion, or boom, normal Shadow Dancer, gone. So we want 3 of these. This is great. It also lets us cheat on our spell count because it's basically a minion because it draws 1. So we only really have 4 cards in our deck that aren't minions in some way or another, which is fantastic for our synergy. So, we're done. It's minions from here on out. It's creatures for days. The first thing that basically any Duelyst deck needs, regardless of its game plan, is 2-drops. We need to be able to play cheap creatures to the board very early on in the game to contest mana tiles. Even if you don't need the mana tiles very much yourself, you also want to be able to push the opponent back, make sure you don't just get steamrolled by a bunch of early minions that you can't remove. So being able to just put a thing that can deal 2 damage on the board is valuable if nothing else is. We're going to want some Crystal Cloakers. This is a Vesper, so you can draw it off Cryogenesis. Usually you'll play one and then replace the others, but we are going to run a 3rd Vesper, which I'll get to later. I'm only playing 2 of these because its ability, it gets stronger on the other side of the board, isn't so great on the first turn. And so while it's useful later, there are other things we could be doing because it doesn't immediately generate value when it hits the field. So a lot of our other cards are just going to be a bit more powerful than it because they have more of an immediate impact, even if the Crystal Cloaker is very big once you're on the opponent's side. Speaking of immediate value, we're going to want some Healing Mystics. I love this card. Everyone loves this card. Healing Mystic also sees a lot of play. It's basic, so you have them already. She just heals 2, but that's great. You can take the edge off an aggro deck damaging your face, or you can hit an opponent's minion with one of yours until it's nearly dead, and then heal your minion up so that it survives, say, a general hit next turn. Want a couple of those. And for our 3rd generic 2-drop, we're going to have some Primus Fists. This is really worth crafting. Normally if you go on Reddit and you say, which Duelyst cards should I craft first? I'm very new. They'll say Primus Fist and Dancing Blades. And if I'm in the thread, I'll also say Sojourner. We'll get to Sojourner. But Primus Fist, awesome. Primus Fist is great because it lets you trade a cheap minion with an expensive one. So if I play a 2/3, right, I play my Healing Mystic on turn 1, and you move forward and you play a Chaos Elemental, some kind of 4/4, right? Some toughness small minion. I'm like, I don't like that very much. Well, now I can drop my Primus Fist, which at worst is a 2/3, so I can also run it out on turn 1 without being too sad. And I can trade my Healing Mystic with your Chaos Elemental. And now I've gained some value because I've still got a creature on the board, and I've got some more mana left for my turn, and I've removed yours. And I've traded my 2 mana minion for your 3 mana minion. That's a little bit of value in itself. You get extra time. It's what we call tempo. It's a tempo play. So I get to very efficiently, in terms of time, remove your minion, and still have time to play something else. So I can remove your minion and develop another, possibly the Primus Fist plus another minion of my own in the same turn. Great card. Plus it's obviously good for attacking your opponent, because you can just deal that extra 2 damage. I have 3 of those. So the next thing Cara needs is card draw. We're talking about card advantage earlier, and Cara wants to get as much value out of her Bloodborne spell as possible. So she wants to have a load of cards in hand. Ideally, when you activate the first Bloodborne spell, you have 5 or 6 minions in your hand. If you're lucky, when you activate the second one, you have 4 or 5, maybe 6 minions in your hand if you have enough draw, or if you haven't been forced to play out a lot of stuff. If you've got a lot of draw, maybe you can have it so that the third Bloodborne spell activation hits, 4 minions, and you're just snowballing huge amounts of massive bodies on the board at that point. There are lots of good ways to draw cards in Duelyst. Not all of them are particularly cheap. So we're looking at making this deck very budget. Perhaps in future episodes I'll have some of the slightly more pricey ones, but I'd like to sort of, keep it real. So the absolute cheapest card draw creature is called Hound. This one gives a symmetrical draw, so it's normally seen in aggro decks, which just want to fill up their hand with cards so that they can just throw enough stuff at the opponent's face to kill them before the opponent does anything relevant. And it's also got a very pointy body. 4 power is quite a lot. This thing will die to your opponent's 2-drop hitting it plus their general, but then their general takes 4, which in an aggressive deck is fine. We're not playing a particularly aggressive deck, but this thing trades up pretty well, and once you've buffed it with Kinetic Surge, it's a real threat. We can also take advantage of the extra draw slightly better than our opponent can, sort of in the same way as an aggro deck. Because we're going to be pumping our minions in hand, on average, the card we draw off Hound is going to be better than the card the opponent draws. If we both draw a Healing Mystic off it, mine might be a 3-4 or a 4-5 by the time I play it, whereas yours is going to be a 2-3 forever. So the Hound's symmetry can be sort of tipped in our direction. So let's chuck a few of those in. And then, I may have mentioned earlier, but this deck only has 1 rare in it. That rare is going to be Sojourner. Sojourner is wonderful. Sojourner is the first rare that I recommend any new player craft. So if you don't have these already, and you've got a bit of dust, get on it. Sojourner is the cheapest staple card draw card. So Hound doesn't go in every deck necessarily. Sojourner, you can throw it in anything and it'll be fine. The only thing holding Sojourner back is the common presence of a card called Zenrui, which can steal it. Cara can get around that by making it large. Zenrui steals creatures with 2 or less power, and Cara can just make it a 3/7. Job done. In the interests of being super budget friendly, like I said, I want this to be accessible to people who've been playing the game for a day. I'm just going to put 1 in, but once you've played with Sojourner, you'll probably want the other 2 as well. She is quality. The last pseudo card draw ability we're going to add is called Ash Method. This card is a bit weird, but very powerful specifically in this deck. So Ash Method is a 2-3 for 5, that's rubbish, and it comes with 2 copies of itself. That's, maybe okay, but they spawn in random places and they're only 2-3s, so eh. But the copies carry the same buff that the original does from Cara's Bloodborne spell. So if you get 2 ticks of Kinetic Surge on your Ash Method, and you play that, it's a 4-5. That then spawns 2 4-5s. Even if it spawns them far away from the action, you still made a 4-5, and then 2 more of them will show up in a couple of turns once they've walked back to the fight. That's quality. That's a lot of value. So while it doesn't explicitly say draw a card on it, playing 3 4-5s for 1 card, that's a 3 for 1. Those things are worth a card at any stage of the game, really. So that effectively draws you 2 cards. So we'll put an Ash Method in. The reason I'm only running 1 is because they're a little clunky. To get the proper value, you need to have it in your hand for a while and not cast it. That's very awkward because, at some point you're going to have to play cards to not die and to push the opponent back. But just having 1 Ash Method, it's not a huge ask to just sit on that for a little while once you draw it on, turn 3 or so. Right, next we're going to need some minions to kind of hold the board in the mid-game and fight the opponent's creatures. A very common staple card that does exactly that is Primus Shieldmaster. This guy is lovely. He has Provoke, so you can lock down your opponent, force the general to stay in one place, and protect your other stuff. And he's also a very respectably sized body. Your opponent will normally have to spend a card removing him, which can eat removal that will be more useful elsewhere. And because he has Provoke, he gets even better when you combine him with Kara's buff. So making this guy a 4/7 or a 5/8, all of a sudden that's just huge, and your opponent's really going to struggle to get through it. They'll probably have to hit it with their general at some point, which means they take increasing amounts of damage. So we'll want 3 of those. And we love Primus Shieldmaster so much that I'm going to kind of throw in a 4th. Can't really do that, but there's a card called Hailstone Golem, which you've probably already seen, which is just the same thing, without Provoke, 1 more power. This thing hits like a ton of bricks. Not quite as good as Primus Shieldmaster, because a lot of creatures that it might be contesting are 2/3s, you know, your opponent's 2-drops. So the extra point of power isn't always relevant, but it's big, it's beefy, it carries buffs very well. Let's put 1 in. Finally, I mentioned earlier that there was going to be a 3rd Vesper, and this one's a spicy one. You may have seen Arctic Displacer before. This card is hilarious. It's not very good in an arbitrary situation because it's only toughness 4. So your opponent can very easily just run a 4-drop into it and kill it. However, it is a Vesper, which means that we can search for it with Cryogenesis. What you do with Arctic Displacer is you just replace it until such time as your opponent doesn't really have much ability to interact with it on the board. Or you keep it in hand until it's like a 13/7 or something, and then you just drop it next to them, and if they can't kill it, they just die. That is a huge power. Again, because it's situational, we only want 1, and we can fetch it up with Cryogenesis to use as an extra sort of win condition. So in goes the Arctic Displacer. So we've still got 15 slots to fill, and obviously I could fill them out by adding duplicates of these cards, but we'd rather fill out our deck with more capabilities. We're sort of doing alright already. We've got a good curve. If you look at the mana curve here, which is the sort of invisible line across the top of these bars, you can see that it peaks at 2, which is generally where you want to be in Duelyst, and tails off appropriately as the cards get more expensive. You don't want as many expensive cards in your deck, because if you draw lots of them, you can't use them early on. And even once you've got 9 mana, you can't play 2 5-drops in the same turn. Never mind activating your Bloodborne spell as well. So you want a decent mass of cheaper cards to increase the chances of playing things early on, to make it easier to play multiple cards or have choices of cards to play in those first crucial few turns. And then of course it also means we can spam out 3 creatures in one turn very easily once we've got a couple of Cara Bloodborne spell activations off, and you can just play 3 4/5s straight up. But we're going to want to keep roughly the same shape of the curve, but flesh it out with creatures with more cool abilities. This is where we go back to the idea of having creatures with kind of rubbish bodies, but really good opening gambit abilities. Things that often die in 1 hit to the opponent's general, but you know, can get enough utility out of their opening gambits that they're played anyway, and then we're just going to make it so that they don't die to the opponent's general and can trade into much larger creatures, and the opponent's just going to be really sad. So, first up is Bloodtear Alchemist. This card is very ubiquitous. It's simply a 1 mana thing that pings for 1. It's sort of a spell. It can ping anything on the board rather than something next to it, unlike most minions with such abilities, which makes it really good for sniping cheap ranged units, things like Pyromancers, which are the Vitruvian Blast unit that you absolutely have to get rid of. Helps you clear up Wraithlings from Abyssians early on, deals the extra bit of chip damage, like you can hit a 2/3 with Cara and then ping it with Bloodtear Alchemist. All sorts of useful things. You know, there are surprisingly few situations where a Bloodtear Alchemist does absolutely nothing. It also helps against things like opponents' artifacts. For instance, like you ping their general and remove a charge from their artifact. Loads of utilities. We'll put a couple of those in. We're going to play Kara's absolute best friend in the world, Ephemeral Shroud. I love this card. You will probably play a lot of these in your illustrious time with Duelyst, and Cara makes them sing, because dispelling things is good, right? Getting rid of Death Wish so you can trade efficiently with something like a Duelyst or Reaper of the Nine Moons, that's great. Dispelling buffs, or creatures that come back after a turn, or even just provokes so you can move safely, all useful. But Ephemeral Shroud dies to the general. But when Cara's around, they can be 5/5s, and then you play a 5/5 for 2 and dispel the useful utility off their minion, and all of a sudden your opponent's like, what is going on? I'm getting destroyed here. And it's all fantastic. We're going to put 3 of those in. Love me some Ephemeral Shroud. Along similar lines, Maw. Another 2/2 for 2, which is not normally great, but it deals 2 damage to a nearby enemy minion. That's pretty good. Even better when it's a 4/4. Let's put 2 of those in. Repulsive Beast. Those of you familiar with Magic the Gathering might have seen things like Mana War, a 2/2 for 3 that returns a minion to its owner's hand. Repulsive Beast, basically the same thing. It's normally used to punt a large enemy minion to the other side of the board, where it'll take it several turns to return to the action, effectively removing it for that time. It's a great delaying tactic. You're going to have to deal with the minion eventually, so it's not a catch-all unless you're playing a really fast deck, but it can give you a lot of time to draw into something else that will deal with it, or overwhelm the opponent in the sort of nearby area. It's also quite good for pushing an enemy next to Cara, so you can kill it for free, for instance. It has a surprising amount of utility. Because the minion comes back and our deck isn't fast enough to always kill the opponent before the minion returns to the fight, I'm only going to put 1 of these in, but it's a really useful thing to have. It's kind of like basically having a 4th Ephemeral Shroud, where when your opponent has a minion that you really just are going to struggle to deal with, Repulsive Beast can make it not a problem for a little while. Next up is Saber Tiger. This is another very commonly played card. You'll see the running theme here. There's loads of good basics. Apparently I've typed it wrong. There we go. Cursed British spelling. So Saber Tiger is pretty wonderful. Sees a ton of play, all the way up to S rank. It's basically a spell that deals 3 damage, except it also benefits from Cara's Bloodborne spell. And once it's been buffed even once, it will survive hitting their general, which means it can deal 4 damage twice, or 5 damage twice, or 6 damage 3 times, or deal a few damage and absorb a card. It's fantastic. So we're going to put 3 of those in. This also gives us a little bit of reach, which we don't really have. There aren't very many ways in this deck to deal out of hand damage, unexpected damage to the opponent's face. But Saber Tiger is the biggest and main way of doing that. Speaking of dealing damage out of hand, Frostbone Naga. So a big weakness of Vannar, this faction, is that they don't really have good area of effect removal. It's difficult for them to clear out a big cluster of Wraithlings, or kill multiple minions with 1 card in the same turn, and sort of swing the board rapidly in your favour in that way. Frostbone Naga definitely has a downside. It's not that big, which obviously Cara can fix pretty nicely. It deals damage to your stuff as well, so you have to be very careful with how you place it. Normally, you want to make sure that the only thing of yours that it's next to, because it has to be next to something to summon it, is Cara herself, because taking 2 damage on your general is not necessarily that bad. But it has enough utility and covers for enough of a weakness in Vannar's general plan, and can swing the board enough that I'm just going to put 1 in. And then finally, the top of our curve and the icing on the cake, Dancing Blades. This is the other card that I mentioned earlier, that if you ask which commons should I craft, everyone will tell you Primus Fist and Dancing Blades. Dancing Blades is like Primus Fist's big terrifying granddad. It is already the size of a Hailstone Golem, a card worth 4 mana by itself, but it also comes with a free Saber Tiger to whatever happens to be standing next to it. Okay, it can't hit your opponent's face, but that can wait till next turn when they have to deal with your 4/6. So this thing is just an absurd amount of value and tempo. It can swing, you play a big minion and remove that minion at the same time. That's a huge swing in the momentum of the game. This card sees a lot of play, and of course it's already big. Making it bigger with Cara just makes it terrifying. So we'll put 3 of those in, and the deck is complete. There are so many opening gambits in this that I'm going to call it Cara and the OGs. and I'm going to mark it as blue because I like color coding my decks according to which faction they're in, because I am so cool, you guys. Okay, so to recap, we have built a mid-range deck against aggressive opponents. We want to outsize them on the board and beat their creatures with our superior creatures. Against controlling decks, we want to play a lot of large minions that they eventually run out of ways to deal with, and get lots of value from our succession of useful opening gambits stapled to those already good minions. The weaknesses of this deck, because obviously everything has weaknesses. One weakness is running out of cards. We've included a little bit of card draw. Like I said, we've got Hound, who is good. We've got Sojourner, who is very good. There are other options that tend to be a bit more expensive, and like I said, I wanted to keep this deck really nicely budget, and it will work as is. But one of the main ways to expand this in future is to add more and better card draw. So if you can afford them, Spelljammers are not uncommon. This is like a Hound that sticks around and doesn't immediately draw your opponent a card. It's kind of a rubbish body, but that doesn't matter so much in Cara. More Sojourners are probably the first place you want to look, upping the Sojourner count to 3. They are vulnerable to Zenru, the card that can steal them, as I mentioned earlier, but you can play around that by making sure they're 3 power before you lay them down. And 3/7 or 4/8 Sojourners, speaking from experience, are awesome. Finally, there's Swan Sister Oki On, which is wonderful to pronounce. Oki On looks like a legendary, but she's one of the 7 sisters, which you get by getting 3 copies of each of 6 rares from a faction, or in her case, from 6 of any neutral rares. That'll take you a while, probably not going to get that in your first week or so of playing, so I've left her out, and we'll probably try and avoid her throughout the series. But Oki On is great for just making sure you have a constant mass of cards, as well as having an, a not too embarrassing body. And she can sometimes put the spells that we're leaving out of the deck deliberately into your hand when you need them, because of exactly how she works. She generates random faction cards rather than just drawing from your deck. Of course, most of the time she'll generate complete, guff, but you just replace it, it's fine, because Duelyst is awesome. So she essentially just draws you 2 cards from your deck. And I would recommend working towards Oki On over time if you can, because she can just be thrown in basically every deck. So that's definitely, if I was going to play this particular list long term, or even this archetype, because there are lots of different ways to build it, all equally good, I would look to putting in a little bit more card draw. Another weakness of the deck is weird combo decks. So I mentioned earlier that we don't really have good area of effect board clears, which can make it very difficult to beat Abyssians with their constant swarm of 1/1s. And then we can't really stop them from filling the board and then applying the synergies, like Deathwatch synergies, like Blood Moon Priestess, Shadow Dancer, that benefit from their minions biting the dust. Things like Deathfire Crescendo, that we find very difficult to interact with. Songhai often play in a sort of combo-y way as well, and that can be quite difficult for us, because although Cryogenesis is very good against them, where's it gone? I scrolled past it. Cryogenesis is very good against them, as is Chromatic Hold. We only have so many of these cards, we're only going to draw so many of these cards, and they have more threats that we need to deal with, and lots of buffs to make any random minion into a potentially very scary threat. There are also Songhai lists that play loads of little 1/1s with ranged in hard to reach areas, and we're going to struggle with those as well. But against decks that just kind of want to play creatures to the board and attack us, or play lots of removal and try and stop us from killing them, we're probably going to be advantaged, or at least have a decent shot of it. I think that wraps this up. I'm going to record the games separately, just both for my own convenience and for yours. So I will see you there. I hope you enjoyed, and I'll see you around.